Welcome to another edition of Underground Strategy. Today we are joined by Professor Tarak Barkawi, an international relations scholar and historian whose work has had a significant impact on our understanding of war and conflict. He explores themes like colonial troops in global conflicts and also the personal stories told by those experiencing war at the sharp end. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Tarak.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Could you perhaps tell us what first got you interested in the study of war?
The answer I give to that question when I'm asked is a funny one. My mother raised me on John Wayne films. She was obsessed with John Wayne. I mean, obsessed. She became a sort of Democrat after Nixon, but she never lost her fascination with John Wayne, the cowboy, and John Wayne, the man's man. And of course, John Wayne of Sergeant Stryker in Sands of Iwo Jima, the Green Beret, and so on. And I think this put a bug in me. The first books I read over and over and over again were Bantam war books that I think I sort of derived from this, watching war movies in my mother's lap. So that's where I became interested in war.
Indeed, those books certainly are part of the culture. And now moving on to your book, could you perhaps unpack that a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in that book. It took me 20 years. It was a PhD book that I held back. And partly, while there is now a lot of scholarship on the Indian Army in the World Wars, as I was producing that, there was a dearth of serious scholarship on the Indian Army in the Second World War. So there's a lot of legwork just to figure out what is going on. And you have to kind of, unpick this, if I may use the technical term, bullshit about the martial races and the idea that only certain Indian populations, those that were taller and whiter and from the north, made proper soldiers. So you have to work through this kind of racial ideology that the British have used more to control their colonial army. And it's good for esprit de corps. I mean, when you tell people that their race is a warrior race, it's a good way to motivate the troops, but it's not, as it were, true that only certain people, only certain races can be soldiers. It hits 2.5 million men. It is the main provider of troops for Britain's war in the East. It's very significant in North Africa and Italy and elsewhere in the Middle East. So this is a major portion. Britain fights World War II as an empire. While this is going on, while the army is being raised, the British have suppressed the Indian national movement. This is the leading anti-colonial movement in the world. They're all locked up and put away. There's a countrywide uprising that starts in August 1942. Just as they're really trying to expand the army. So there's a major anti-British, anti-colonial movement happening while the Indian Army is being massively expanded. You can see why it's a perfect case for my argument that you can raise armies despite the politics that are going on and motivate troops to fight in very difficult circumstances despite all of this going on. So I go through all of this. There's an element of the Indian Army that is based on material interests. The British took care of their soldiers. They're paid well. There's a major famine in India during World War II. The soldiers are fed. Their families are taken care of. But as I'm sure also many of your listeners know that, pay is not what gets you to risk your life. So where does that additional piece come from? And, what I develop is a kind of account of a battlefield not as a place where people express their national culture, where troops have particular cultural characteristics, but the battlefield as an extremely unforgiving space that developed a particular form of combat that is related to the doctrine of the two armies, the terrain they're fighting over, all the kinds of factors that go into shaping military encounters. But that battlefield evolves a structure. The easiest way to sort of explain this, if you're fighting an enemy and you believe that that enemy does not take prisoners and will torture you if you're taken prisoner, you have a motivation to fight to the end. And on the other side, if they believe that you will not take prisoners, that you'll be very badly mistreated if you become a prisoner, you also will fight to end, and you can ratchet up the fighting, especially in close quarter terrain like the forests of Burma. There's an element of, encounters are surprised, they're at close range and so forth. And so the fighting takes on a peculiarly intense character in which there is a refusal to accept surrender, and your choices are to fight or flee. And people locked in that kind of combat respond to the pressures of the battlefield that they're in. And if you want to understand why it is that the fighting takes on this no quarter character, it's this structure of battle that you have to look at. So that's a big part of the sort of middle part of the book looks at that and evolves an account of both of these arguments I was making about conceiving military training as ritual that can be applied to any people, but then looking at what happens when these units go to war.
It's primal, right?
It's not modern.
No, and you kind of take it to the base instincts of survival. And this is interesting. I'm wondering if we could just revisit for a second this idea you just mentioned, the ritual of training and how that's not necessarily Western. It's not a martial race. It's not Prussian. It doesn't have to be French, British. It doesn't have to be the Sikhs in India. It doesn't have to be them. It could be anyone. I think the Zulus in South Africa did the same. They were a formidable group, but that was because of the training and the drill that you mentioned. And I'm just wondering, and it's not really a question, more just a thought, how that played out in this kind of battlefield, because you had the training which kind of solidifies you as a unit or really builds the bonds, and then you are put in this unforgiving and brutal
life or death
theater of operation, life or death.
Yeah, sure. So here we go with a little more anthropology. If you look at the combat motivation debates, and this is an assumption shared by Schills and Janowitz and the people who critique them, arguing that ideology was more important to holding the German army together than primary groups. The assumption is that casualties are corrosive of group spirit, right? So esprit de corps falls apart at some level of casualties. We could debate, is that 20%? Is it 50%? What is the point at which a unit falls apart? And of course, casualties do degrade fighting power. And at some point, people do run away or stop fighting when it becomes evident that you're not going to make it or you have a high chance of not making it. But I think this totally misreads the significance of casualties, both for units that are actually fighting, the group of people you're talking about who go out into this unforgiving environment, but also in the way that we train people and make them think about the regiment's honor or the country's honor. Casualties are the fuel of fighting spirit. When a solitary group, when a group takes casualties, when one of its members is killed, that group becomes closer together than they were before. And my scholar for this is Durkheim and the elementary forms of religion, which he bases on anthropology about Australian Aboriginal tribes. None of that's particularly important, but his argument is that your life force is released into the group when you die. And that is when logics of blood sacrifice and revenge take over. So casualties, both in the kind of memory of past casualties as you kind of learn the history of your unit, and, when your corporal is killed or your buddy is killed, you want to go get some. When you think about that logic happening on both sides of a battle, you can see how a battle can be a self-generating event where the soldiers on both sides get more and more angry, more and more wanting to take lives of each side. And not all of them have to be this way. Obviously, only some of them may respond and be able to overcome their fear and sort of be driven by this, but that's enough to keep the thing going. And that is an entirely internal to the army on both sides kind of logic. You don't need Nazi ideology or patriotism or anything to get you going in that kind of cycle. So again, I've not had reference to, anything that looks modern. This is something that we can sort of understand for Roman soldiers as much as we can understand for British Indian soldiers.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's timeless. There's a continuity in that.
The continuity is in the texts, in the techniques, in the rituals, right? That's that kind of heritage where you take those manuals from those places. And when you read the drill manuals of the Indian Army, they evoke the drill manuals of the Romans, right? And they're kind of interesting because the people who write them are very good teachers. They know their students, They don't try to give too many over lectures. Just let the guy look at the mechanism of the machine gun. He'll figure it out, and sit with him and so on. And don't let the bright soldiers, run the show, make sure everyone comes along and so forth. They're thinking about this and what they're producing are soldiers.
And I think at its most basic level, if you take the average physically fit human being.
Young man.
I didn't want to but yes.
I know. It can also be young women, but yes, historically.
Yeah, for history's sake, It's not that hard. And people have figured that out. You mentioned anthropology, and maybe we'll delve a little bit into how ideas are spread, but it's not that complicated. And if Shaka Zulu can figure it out, if Sikhs can figure it out.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Shaka Zulu because, of course, that looks a lot like the Romans, right? Age-grouped cohorts, throwing spears released just before contact with the enemy, dedicated logistics corps. The Zulus had a pretty serious military operation. And now we are talking about something Western fashion where you underestimate the military power of people you're colonizing or people who are non-white and get yourself in trouble like the British did at Isandlwana and other kind of colonial disasters.
I'm not an expert. I mean, we do have some requests for Isandlwana.
Yeah.
And I remember years when I was doing, second year military history, I remember reading one of the excuses was we couldn't open the ammunition box. No one was buying that. Come on, no one's buying that.
Of course, that's a standard one. I think that made its way into the movie, Zulu Dawn.
And you mentioned that about Shaka Zulu, and we'll need someone to correct me, but what I do remember about that is that if a Zulu warrior had basically a wound in the back, that was a sure way to get yourself into deep trouble because they took it as some sort of cowardice. So it was drilled in. You mentioned the launching of certain spears. The shields were designed to hook, open up and, thrust. I know no one can see me doing it, but I was trying to do the actions on the video, which we aren't making public.
The point that is interesting about the Zulus, I'm not an expert either. I know a little bit about it, but the point that's interesting about the Zulus is not that there was some Roman manual that made its way, down to southern Africa. The point is that people looking to train soldiers in different parts of the planet at different moments in history come up with very similar solutions, right? The regular army isn't invented in Europe and dispersed around the world. The regular army is discovered in ancient China. It's discovered in ancient Greece. It's discovered in ancient Africa. African armies released arrows in volleys long before the Europeans ever showed up. Drill, groups, use of weapons in common, all the kinds of things we associate with the regular army is not a European discovery that is diffused. It's something that's discovered in different times and places. That said, there are national styles, right? There are particular civilizational styles. So obviously, if the British colonized you, you have an army that looks closer to what they're doing in Sandhurst than in Saint-Cyr. If the Americans are your supporter in the Cold War, you go to infantry school at Fort Benning. Well, it's Benning again now, or Hal Moore, for those of you who are following everything going on in the U.S. But anyway, so you have an American character to what you're doing. But that's different than saying that the core of what is driving these military units is kind of some kind of political culture or political ideology. You could have that, but just to come back to the East Front for a moment, the ideology argument has a very kind of funny character to it. It depends on military discipline being rooted in the agreement of all the soldiers on a politics, right? I don't think militaries work that way. I think militaries are a much more general kind of discipline. People could believe all kinds of shit in an infantry unit, but they're still going to fight together.
Alright, quick checkpoint. If you're finding value in this episode, leave us a review on your app. It really makes a difference. Watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to stay sharp. Now back to it.
They certainly are. It's just that the discipline of a well-trained unit, it's too strong. It's the drill kicks in. You had mentioned drill, and you mentioned earlier about muscle memory and how, I know we might be stepping into anthropological terms now, but if you could say the group muscle memory, that drill reinforces that. And there's no ways, unless you have a failure of professionalism or discipline, like the fragging and so on.
Of course, all kinds of stuff. But, another kind of aspect is, another sort of question that people have tried to answer with this ideology stuff is, why do people at the bottom of the social hierarchy join an army and fight for that social hierarchy, right? Like in Vietnam, it's, poor white kids and poor black kids who are fighting in the American army. In the colonial armies I'm talking about, it's literally the colonized people who are fighting. In the British Army, it's the East End and people from the North and the borders who are in the army. So well, I think one of the ways to understand that is not that they're confused by nationalism or they believe, in that their betters are better than them and so on. It's that when you're in an army, you partake of the power of that group that you're in. It is inflating of your ego, of your sense of self and place in the world to be part of such a powerful organization. And I think that, that's another anthropological insight about, what it's like to be in a group. When the officers of a regiment are toasting the regiment, they're toasting themselves. This is a Durkheimian insight.
You are too damn right. When I left the military, it took me, I would say, 7 months to understand that I'm just a human being in society. There's no chip on your shoulder. You live in this world, as you mentioned, for a long time where you have inverted commas, air quotes, a vocation. I serve something greater. I am important.
Yeah.
And when you leave, you're like, well, nah, no one really cares. You actually have to go and...
I'm just an average Joe. Yeah.
Very average, extremely average. And you need to find yourself, redesign yourself, kind of figure out a little bit more. And I think even before you can understand it academically, you understand you in the surrogate family, you create these mantras and traditions, you understand it, but you're drinking the Kool-Aid while you're there.
Yeah.
When you said that totally resonated with myself. It's a pity Max couldn't join us this evening because he would have a couple of things you can imagine in the Special Forces community. Those things that you just mentioned are even stronger, right? Probably from what I've heard. I'm just a conventional person myself, but that really is interesting. And I think we had mentioned the person I'm working with, Brigadier General Sereko, a black guy and a brilliant guy serving in the apartheid army. And just because he needed a job, he needed to do something. It's not that he believed everyone's feeding the stuff, communism is coming. But after that, he distinguishes himself and becomes the first black commandant of the Defense College. He leads the Modern Light Brigades just before he goes into retirement. And now, we are writing his memoirs, as I mentioned. But you have all the things you've mentioned. Race doesn't matter. Here you have someone who might be underestimated in an apartheid system and maybe afterwards, or certain people that have racial beliefs. He grew up in an operational unit and he distinguishes himself. And when we have the African Renaissance, Thabo Mbeki, 2001 onwards, he gets deployed to the Congo and they don't know what's coming because he shows what a conventionally trained officer, regardless of your skin color, can do. And he distinguishes himself again. I'm not trying to sell the story, just to illustrate how it resonates.
It's a very interesting story, and I don't know the individual you're talking about, but one thing I would assume about him is he also just enjoyed being a soldier, right? As a profession, as a vocation, he liked that. And the army that was available to him to join was the South African army,
100%.
There's a British officer line, I'm paid to be a professional, not a patriot, and I think captures that. And I think that's in some ways the utility of the Queen or the King. You're above the party politics of the day, and you serve your profession, your vocation, your regiment, however it is you understand it. And now we're in a military space that is in a different set of calendars than political time and political ideology, and I think is much more suited to explaining why it is that armies, war, battle are constants in history. It is not difficult to raise an army and get young people to fight. And it's only from a kind of civilian way that you would think that this is some really difficult, horrible thing, then there must be some special ideological explanation for why it is that we have armies. I don't think that's the case. And in many ways, I am very aware, and I'm certain your listeners are aware too, that many of the things I'm saying are kind of stock wisdom that I think in some ways has been lost in some of the debates that were specifically wrapped up in the history of the Holocaust and the Nazis. Because if you look at what armies we study, right, what is the most military history and especially military sociology, what is it written about? It's written about the German army, the American army, right? The French and the British have roles in there. There's some Japanese, there's some Russians, of course, from the Cold War, but that's it. So the historical kind of basis of the theories we have is limited mostly to these Western nations and really these Atlantic nations. And, this is part of what it means to take a post-colonial perspective on things. The idea is, that you're beating up on the Westerners. The idea is that you look at global experience, not with a Western lens, but using the experience of others, like the Indian Army, to allow you to rewrite the theories and the concepts that we have that are derived just from this small subset of Western modern national armies, right? And that's the move that is really interesting to take a colonial army and look at it not just to write its history and, oh, it's so interesting, but to look at it as a source of theory about why soldiers fight, and to use that to critique theories that are derived from an overemphasis and over-attention to Western national armies in the modern era. Now you've sort of got my kind of Soldiers of Empire book out there.
I think you're going to get a note from Tom Thorpe after this to ask you to come into his podcast, the Combat Morale one. And I feel like you've just looked into my computer, because that's one of the first lines in this book about Sareko. It says, I serve the uniform and the constitution of this country. I am not a party politician. And he says, I have served the SADF.
And he got the uniform first.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what he says. And he says, now, like many before me, I'm going to write to you and tell you a little bit about me and my life. That kind of touches on a theme that you explore in your studies, in your immense scholarship, also about soldiers who write memoirs. And, we can go to Xenophon or some of the big names historically, or just, as you said earlier, the average Joe who just says, I was there, this is what I did. And, I was lucky enough to be at the Military History Consortium last year. Was it last year? Last year.
It was last year, yeah.
Oh, it's just time flies.
That's fun. I like that conference.
It was loads of fun, and you gave a great talk.
Yeah.
And it was about memoirs. So could you maybe tell us a little bit, because to me it resonates, right? That people want to share a little bit, but how you experience memoirs, sort of part of the bigger narrative on war and conflict.
I don't know quite where to start, but let me say this. There is a lot of writing, a lot of scholarship on soldiers' writing. And most of that scholarship focuses either on soldiers explicitly set out to write a memoir, or soldiers who become poets or fiction writers, right? Novelists or First World War poets or so on, right? But there's a kind of soldiers' writing that I think is really significant. I do think it's related very closely to memoirs, that you're not wrong to invoke that. But we don't think about it normally as a kind of soldier's writing, and that's military history. And in particular, campaign or battle history, what university scholars with a kind of sneer would say, is traditional military history, drums and trumpets military history. As Michael Howard once called it, nursery school military history. I've got that slightly wrong, but something to that effect. And in fact, most of what we regard as kind of the truth of war, right? Fighting, battle, campaigning, is written not only by soldiers, but soldiers who were veterans of the very wars that they're writing about. So what I was talking about in Lancaster is this intimate connection between battlefield experience that particular individuals have, and coming out of that battlefield with the desire to research and write a history about something, a set of questions, research questions, I'd even argue, that come out of their wartime experience. And while some people go and write the sort of standard account, like I joined the army, I went to basic training, I left my family, I went off to war, I had my baptism of fire, I became a, unhappy veteran, and here I am writing something for my kids or whatever. Instead, they come out of it and they want to know, why did we have to do that? This book I'm working on now is set with the Americans in Korea. But, why did the Chinese surprise us? Why did that happen, right? Why were we put in a situation where, costly heroism was required? And when I get home, or when I, retire from my civilian career, I'm going to go in the archives. I'm going to interview people who were there. I'm going to write a history of this. And this kind of soldier's writing as a form of soldier's writing is something connected to war experience. That is not something that anyone has really written about. But the minute you say to people that the military historians are very frequently veterans of the wars that they're writing about, you start looking at history books, you'll find that I'm not far afield with that. You mentioned Xenophon. Xenophon's Anabastus, the Persian expedition, as it's sometimes translated. Let me close off this intervention with this. People debate, what is that? What genre of writing? Is it a memoir, right? Is it a self-justification? I would argue it's kind of the first kind of campaign history that we have in the Greco-Roman tradition, that comes down to us. And if you go back and look at that book, this is a professional soldier, and Xenophon would argue is one of history's first professional soldiers. He's attentive to what a camp is like after the day's march. He's attentive to the debates that soldiers are having about what's going on. He reports the shape of fighting and how contingent events drive things. He gives you a campaign history that he has probably written in conversation with other veterans who were there. He would have had some records to hand. They survived some of his moves by the time he wrote this, and so on. So understanding this as a kind of soldier's history that gives us the truth of war and centers on fighting is, I think, something that we need to think about. We need to have a Paul Fussell Great War in Modern Memory for soldier historians.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I love everything you've said there.
Yeah, I can keep going on that one.
I'm absolutely fascinated, and we'll send you a copy of Max's memoir 788, where he speaks about basically just his initial experiences in the military. And like I said, he's not here with us, but we work together so much. I sometimes forget that, he's had almost maybe a decade of literally being in a war zone for 10 years. And I don't know any American that's done it. Maybe you go back to this, like living, maybe a few. But when he wrote this memoir and I helped him, we'll send you a copy. He says something that for me chimes with what you've said there. He says, we did it for, and he almost pokes fun, the greater good.
Yeah, with an irony. Yeah.
And you have to reconsider these things, when you take, and this is not Max, it can be anyone, you take a young person, young man, young woman, or anyone beyond the binary, and you put them in these situations, and then there's something exploitative in it, if you know what I mean. And my God, it could be kindergarten history. And, I'm a big fan of Sir Michael Howard. So that wasn't meant for him. But I just meant you take anyone that says it's drums and trumpets or whatever. But there's a place for it. There's a very big place because there's a human story, right?
Yeah. Michael Howard, he was engaged in a different exercise, which is trying to legitimate an academic department of war studies. His kind of war in the round, war is an interdisciplinary happening, and we need departments that are composed of people from different disciplines in order to understand war. And this, I think, is the heyday of KCL's War Studies Department. There are philosophers, there are literature people, there are historians, there are sociologists. There's a range of people who are coming to bear. And the academy, the university is sort of based on the kind of Enlightenment principle that the normal state of human social existence is peace and that war is an interruption, right? And so, none of the disciplines that come out of the Enlightenment oriented towards war, right? We don't have a war studies discipline in the academy. And in fact, as many people will know, university history departments, especially in the US, not as much as in Britain, don't like to hire traditional military historians. So when Michael Howard makes this comment about nursery history, he's positioning the kind of military history I'm talking about as a kind of popular practitioner history, real history, done by academics, looking at proper sources with the proper kinds of methods and so on, is what we're doing in the university. And he needed to make that distinction. But I think this is part and parcel of I call the university historians guild historians. The guild doesn't like to pay attention that a lot of history is being written, is being produced outside of the academy. And military history is an extremely important kind of practitioner or popular historiography that has been produced outside of the academy, sometimes by people who get graduate degrees and, who are trained up in PhD in histories and also have military experience. But many times they're amateur historians. They're kind of like the anti-colonial historians like C.O.R. James, was a Afro-Carib dude in London in the 1930s who's a big cricket commentator who writes a history book about the Haitian Revolution. He does that well in advance of any of Western academic interest in the Haitian Revolution. He does it with a loan from his baker. He goes to Paris and he writes of the battles and politics and events of the Haitian Revolution and produces a book that has been absolutely central to university scholarship in the last 30 years. But he did it just as an ordinary guy. I argue that military historians are very similar to that. Where we get our idea of war, what happened in World War II, what is significant about the Korean War, blah, 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 a lot of it is coming from history books that are written by veterans of those wars. And so we need to understand the connection between what happens to you in war experience and what kind of research agenda, what kind of history you want to write when you come out of that. And that's what I'm trying to put my finger on in this book on the Korean War.
I look forward to reading it for one, and I'm sure there are many out there who are looking forward to it too. I remember during the conference at Lancaster, not that I want to completely geek out because our listeners are going to be like, shut the hell up now, but you had mentioned similar themes, the importance of these documents, of these letters, of these books. And someone in the audience, doesn't matter who, had said to you, yeah, but we, as you call it, the guild historians, we know more. They better respect us. I don't know if you remember this. And I remember you were quite emphatic. You said, well, I'm absolutely not saying that. What I'm saying is that we should engage in respectful dialogue and from there see a way forward that give everyone their place. But right there was a case in point to what you had said, where there was a certain, I don't know, kind of just belief or understanding that one is not better, but there was a hierarchy a little bit higher than the other. And I've sort of touched both sides of it, right? And the person writing a memoir who's from the field has no pomposity, if I can generalize, right?
Some of them do, but yeah.
Oh, they do, right. Okay, well,
yeah.
God.
No, I accept what you're saying. I'm just, you go on. Sorry.
I mean, there has to be exceptions to prove the rule. Your average person, right? I mean, okay, there might be something to prove, like, deep down, but I just meant compared to someone that has to make a living from it, I see the value on both sides, right? But I don't see them as mutually exclusive.
So it's a big area. Part of what I'm trying to suggest is that the knowledge we have about war, about fighting and combat and so on, is shaped by war, fighting and combat, right? The military histories are in a way internal to war. Not trying to get too outrageously conceptual on you, but if you have a set of experiences at the front and you want to understand those experiences by writing a history, the motivation for that study, the questions that you have are coming out of those experiences. They are shaping what it is that you are writing as a history. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is situate what happens to these guys who become historians at the war front and how they turn that into a history book afterwards. And we have interpreted those histories without attention to what's happening to them at the war front, without the kind of attention I'm giving, like proper archival attention. But if you go back to like Paul Fussell's Great War in Modern Memory, the power of that book comes from situating what is happening on the Western Front with its poetic expression, right? With what the veterans are writing about in their letters, in their poems, in their novels, and so on. And he makes sense of those poems, novels, and so on by reference to the experience of frontline soldiers. I want to make a similar kind of move with history writing. And let me just kind of package that together with, a character that is kind of transitional for me between the Indian Army book and this new interest I have in soldier historians. And that's this guy named Louis Allen. Louis Allen is a funny dude. He's Jewish and Lithuanian parents, grows up in Yorkshire, very poor. He gets himself a scholarship to study French at Manchester before the war. The war starts, and SOAS takes him because he's good with languages to train him up in Japanese. He goes out to Burma as an intelligence officer in 14th Army. And after the war, he has a big war. I won't get too detailed into it, but after the war, he comes back. He finishes his PhD. He goes to Durham University to teach French. He becomes a scholar of an interesting French dude who went to Japan and so on and so forth. But he starts writing about the war as a historian, even though he's in this French department. And he starts producing books. And one of the things that he does that very few people had done before then is he goes and uses Japanese language sources. So he goes into the Japanese archives. He knows Japanese veterans. He was actually a translator for war crimes investigations after the war ended. And when he writes an account of Burma that draws on Japanese sources, British and Canadian, like Anglophone veterans, get really angry with him. Why is he taking seriously what the Japanese said? Why is he crediting, what the Japanese are on about? Why is he giving them voice in this book? There's very angry correspondence from these veterans. In particular, they circulate around whether this one brigade commander had had a nervous breakdown. Allen knew that he had. Many of the veterans who had been in that unit at the Battle of Sangchak did not know that. So this sort of historiographic dispute carries out in the letters in Louis Allen's papers at Durham. And you can see there the intense interest of veterans, not only that there's a history of what happened, but they want a particular kind of history. And they have a hard time with a history that has warts on it. because they think it reflects on their units, on their comrades, and so on. And I think any person who's been in archives who's listening to this podcast will, if they've seen the papers of a military historian, they will see what I'm talking about. People struggle over these texts, and they struggle because what is important to them comes from their war experience. It's that picture I'm trying to understand about how this kind of traditional military history, this battle historiography, is produced.
Quick pause. If you're enjoying this episode, why not buy us a beer? It's the best way to keep Underground Strategy sharp and running. Hit undergroundstrategy.com/support to fuel the mission. Cheers to you. Let's get back into it.
It really is a fascinating area, Tarak. I mean, honestly, it really is fascinating. And can we go for a second and take it from that kind of engagement between the practitioner who's been there, the histories they write, and the broader discussion, and take it a step further? You had mentioned kind of the battlefield being more than just a place of killing, of combat, but a place of some sort of exchange. I think in some of your work, you take it forward even to a bigger scale in terms of globalization, that kind of link between war and globalization. Could you maybe give us a line on that?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I think is kind of an interesting contradiction is the way that, soldiers are often perceived as these sort of, people who are beholden to their own culture. For some reason, can't think of the word that I'm looking for, but I'm thinking of someone who, believes only their country, right or wrong, is a big nationalist, hates foreigners, and so on. But if you have any kind of knowledge about militaries and soldiers, you know that they're some of the most well-traveled people around. And they encounter, not only on battlefields, but in all kinds of other places, other people from other parts of the world. And they often are experienced kind of multicultural, cosmopolitan characters who, come home with bits of culture, with material culture, beliefs, all kinds, maybe even a wife from these distant places that they've gone to. And so understanding them, one of the meanings of globalization is sort of encounters with difference, crossing borders, cultural encounters, and so on. And in that sense, I think soldiers are kind of leading force of globalization. I mean, you can imagine what these kind of Indian recruits think when they're being trained up by these British officers, 200 years of the British Indian Army. If that's not an encounter with difference, I don't know what is, right? So that's one of the ways that I pick at the kind of contemporary academy and its obsession with multiculturalism and so forth by bringing soldiers into it. So I could say a little bit more about that, but I think that also you understand globalization as the creation of a kind of a common planetary system of trade and politics and information exchange. It's armies that put that together and navies that put that together, create the structures within which all this kind of cultural and social globalization happens. So there's a larger argument that is not the one I think we're interested in right there about globalization and war.
But it is cool. It is kind of interesting because you kind of see it also in, you had mentioned manuals and in the traditions, right? My listeners will be bored of this crap from me already, but I've worked with the Indian Army and absolutely brilliant. And you kind of see this mixture of the old British traditions in it. I don't think you'll find in any unit.
They like their regiments.
Oh my God. And I mean, you'd have the Indian Army with bagpipes in kind of Eastern Congo. It's just brilliant.
Exactly. Yeah. Cultural melange, right? The Scottish Highlands off there in the Himalayas, Yeah.
It's absolutely lovely.
It's normal. And the British Army still calls its laundry doby and so on. There are all kinds of shared terms. The U.S. Marines have all kinds of terms that come from their presence in Asia for so much of their history. So, if you want multiculturalism, come to the military.
It really is true what you're saying. And, like commando coming from the Boers in the Boer War.
Yep.
A lot of this probably someone needs to fact check me, but, it's...
Yeah.
It really is true. Tarak, do you still see that colonial history sometimes having an impact in modern day kind of society, maybe in conflicts?
Well, I mean, you just mentioned one of them, right? I mean, India is a very powerful state and a big economy and has its own thing now. But most of the armies around the world descend from colonial forebears or from the advise and support systems that were set up in the Cold War. I mean, one of the reasons why global South countries are, I think, mistakenly aligning themselves with Russia in the Ukraine war is because they have fond memories of the Soviets and their days being trained by the GRU and the University of the Third World in Moscow and so on. So there is a heritage that is colonial and Cold War, which I would argue is a kind of informal imperialism, which is very present in political military relations the world over. That is, I think, a kind of very important place where, there's lots. That's an important place where specifically colonial and Cold War military histories are still, I think, extremely relevant. You get this kind of very interesting kind of cultural beholdenness to your colonizer of long ago. I'm not an expert on the contemporary Indian army, but the Modi regime would like to get rid of some of this regimental identity stuff and have a mass national army, and the officer corps will find all kinds of ways to hang on to their regimental traditions, which of course are derived from their fucking colonizer. It's a strange setup, but that is true of the Nigerian military. It's true of the Kenyan military. It's true of, pretty much any global South military that you want to mention. Then when you look at the pathways of where the officers are trained, that they're still going to service schools in the former colonizer or the former superpower patron, that doctrine, interoperability, the kind of cultural relations that enable in moments of crisis for someone who is at Sandhurst with, Officer X from Africa or South Asia or whatever it is, they can communicate at a moment of crisis and refer back. So there are all kinds of ways in which these colonial military histories, I think, are still present and still having effects on international politics.
I love that answer. The regimental traditions is just so strong, right? The Gurkhas, even the Indians, of course, have their Gurkha regiments. You never take it from them, right? In one form or another, it'll remain. And
you can even take it to Yorkshire, which is where it is now, right? Like the Brigade of Gurkhas, right? If I'm not mistaken. There it still is. And, that's also like a form of migrant labor, but you dress it up with regimental traditions and you make it into something special. And we're back to where we started this conversation about how people get drawn up into the military.
Yeah. And people are lining up to join those regiments,
Yeah.
Because it's for some of the reasons we mentioned previously. It's not all for political reasons, but just because they want to make a difference locally, become someone, etc.
Or have a better life, immigrate to the West or get better pay, there's a lot of reasons like that. And then you add on the special thing that makes you willing to risk your life.
Oh, yeah, that's the first thing, right? That's absolutely the first thing. So as we come to a close, Tarak, if you could go back in history and be in the camps before, after battle of one historical setting, you can choose two if you must, but if you could choose one, just to be a kind of fly on the wall present at a historical conversation, which campaign would it be?
That's a surprise question. I get obsessed with the thing that I'm working on at the moment I'm working on it, right? So I don't have an answer like for all time, what I would like to hear. If I were to draw out an all-time answer, like a lot of people, I grew up reading about World War II and about the German military. And I'd always kind of want to understand, why people who come out of one of the most advanced cultures in the world could get themselves supporting such a regime. And so what German generals were saying to one another in private as the sort of full nature of what they'd gotten themselves into became clear to them, I would like to hear that. There is some stuff like that. There's some interesting scholarship on recordings of German POWs where you get them, talking when they're not aware that they're being listened to and have sort of views on this kind of thing. So you can go read about some of this. But right now, all I want to know about is the first year of the Korean War. Chosin Reservoir, Chipyong-ni, Pusan Perimeter, Kunu-ri, which I'm obsessed with. That's where 2/3 of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division gets totally wiped out by the Chinese. And then is not really written about very much. That's what I'm thinking about now. And it's characters from that project, which are really in my head, which I'm not going to bore you with.
Well, that's definitely something we would love to have you back on, Tarak. Firstly, a big thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's been fun.
It's been so good. And thank you so much to our listeners.
It's been a pleasure, everyone.